And speaking of looking worse and worse, as John Heilman showed us in the tabloids, New York tabloids, yet another one of the president's allies appears to have turned on him. NBC News has confirmed that David Pecker, the publisher of the National Enquirer and a longtime acquaintance of Donald Trump, has been granted immunity in the federal investigation into Michael Cohen. Now, according to court documents, the tabloid's parent company, American Media, sought to keep former Playboy model Karen McDougal silent about her alleged affair with Donald Trump by paying her $150,000 for the rights to her story. And as we've reported, the president's former fixer, Michael Cohen, pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations that were connected to that payment. And then he implicated Donald Trump, saying the then candidate Trump directed and coordinated what most prosecutors would say it was an illegal campaign contribution. And it was. By the way, I've heard a lot of people talking, I've heard Donald Trump talking about it. That was an illegal campaign contribution to himself. And the fact that Donald Trump said, oh, I did it myself. No, it's aimed, the purpose of it was aimed at keeping an embarrassing story under wraps right before an election. You can't write a check for $10,000 to yourself before the election without reporting it, let alone as much as he did. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal, Pecker's assistance appears to have played a vital role in what transpired with Cohen earlier this week. And then there's also the new reporting on the power that David Pecker may hold over the president. 5 people who are familiar with the National Enquirer's parent company, American Media, tells the AP that the company kept a safe containing damaging stories on the president. You just kind of wonder how big that safe was. It had to be a big safe, including documents of the hush money payments to women who claimed to have had affairs with the president. They said the safe was a great source of power for the tabloid CEO. And former employees also tell the AP that the tabloid has been protecting the president for more than a decade and that negative stories about Trump were, quote, dead on arrival, dating back to his time on The Apprentice. The AP is also reporting that, fearful the documents might be used against American Media, Pecker and the company's chief content officer removed them from the safe in the weeks before Trump's inauguration, according to one person who was directly familiar with the events. It's not exactly clear whether the documents were destroyed or simply moved to a safer location. The AP also obtained a March letter to House Democrats in which American Media General's counsel wrote, quote, any suggestion that it would seek to extort the President of the United States through the exercise of its editorial discretion is outrageous, offensive, and wholly without merit. Jonathan Lemire, the Associated Press, obviously breaking this story. Again, here's another example of a guy who was an acquaintance or a friend with Donald Trump, who's now flipped on him, of course, to protect himself, but also showing the transactional nature of every one of Donald Trump's relationships through the years.
That's right. And this is great reporting by my colleagues at the AP, Jeff Hortz, chief among them. But it continues a trend. We have seen for a president who talks so much about loyalty, who tells people around him that he wants his own, Eric Holder or Bobby Kennedy in terms of the attorney general, and he's upset that Jeff Sessions betrayed him, in his words, by recusing himself from the Russia organization. This is happening more and more frequently, whether it is Omarosa or Michael Cohen or now David Pecker, where people are out to save themselves. That they realize that loyalty with Donald Trump is a one-way street, that he doesn't show much for them, and here, at a time of true crisis, they are not going to show much in return. And the role of the National Enquirer and the American and AMI is really a fascinating one in Donald Trump's rise. I mean, it was positive story after positive story during those early months of the campaign to help him sort of block out the sun in terms of the other candidates running for president in 2015 and then into 2016.
Well, and Jonathan, we talked about it on the show a good bit. It was pretty remarkable how during the campaign, Ben Carson goes ahead in Republican polls. Suddenly, you have the National Enquirer doing a story saying he left a sponge inside the brain of one of his patients and almost killed them. When Michael Flynn, in fact, inside the White House, when Michael Flynn was about to get fired, that week, early that week, you had the National Enquirer saying Trump has rooted out the Russian spy in his White House, and it's none other than General Flynn. And of course, Trump fires him a couple days later. It was pretty easy to see, and pretty easy. If we saw it, then I'm sure the special counsel has seen it, that whenever David Pecker went after somebody, that person would be a target of Donald Trump's. You're right. It's been incredibly valuable for Donald Trump.
And let's remember, earlier this year, the National Enquirer put out a negative story about Michael Cohen, just as soon after the raid into his office and such, which many people around Cohen, I know, interpreted as a warning shot from the president, like be careful. And look, the contents of this vault remain a mystery to this point. Trump is not the only celebrity, apparently, who has perhaps damaging stories has been locked away by the Enquirer, who David Pecker has potentially to wield influence over them. And certainly in terms of the reporting that we've done, a source of great frustration to the reporters who work at the Enquirer and AMI, some of whom do very good work, and who felt like they had the ability to, they've had career-making stories disappear because Pecker was trying to protect his friends.
Yeah, you talk about career-making stories. It's fascinating. They actually had a story on John Edwards that had it been picked up and had it been followed, chances are very good that Barack Obama would have never been president of the United States. John Edwards was splitting the vote at the time, and nobody followed that story. And so Edwards stayed in the race just long enough to split the vote. And again, I'm not saying anything, by the way, if you're a Barack Obama fan. This is not negative against the former president. This is just the reality. He was splitting the vote, but nobody really followed that Enquirer story. People said it was trash. Of course, it ended up being the truth. Barbara McQuaid, from idle speculation on my part to hard, cold facts on yours. Tell us about what's the impact of David Pecker starting to cooperate with Robert Mueller's investigation.
Well, the cooperation of David Pecker could be a very significant fact in this investigation because it gives prosecutors something they really love, which is the opportunity to cut out a witness who has a lot of baggage like Michael Cohen. Up until now, he's been the only link to President Trump's involvement in this. If you can instead get someone like David Pecker, who has more credibility and who can document things with documents in his safe, now you may not even need to call Michael Cohen as a witness at any trial. You can instead go to David Pecker, who is going to have not only testimony but likely documents. I think the other significant fact that comes out of this is the shifting stories we're seeing now from President Trump. This is something prosecutors identify as a red flag of what's known as consciousness of guilt. First it was there was no payment. Then it was I didn't know about the payment. Now it's, well, I knew about the payment, but that's not a crime. That shifting story suggests that he feels like he has had something to hide, and that also is important evidence. So I think this is an important development in the investigation.
Well, Barbara, also the consciousness of guilt. I think I've heard you talk about that before, heard other prosecutors talk about that before. Nowhere does that play more importantly in this Russian probe than the meeting at Trump Tower. They say now, oh, doesn't matter. There's nothing to it. Everybody does it. Well, no, if everybody did it, if it was just a matter, what people do is a matter of course, then of course they wouldn't have lied about it from the beginning, said the meeting was about adoption, said the meeting was about something else, said that nobody knew about the meeting, said they didn't know. I mean, Donald Trump's still lying, saying, or Rudy Giuliani saying, well, they didn't even know that this lawyer was from Russia. Isn't that a perfect example of consciousness of guilt? They knew what they were doing would make them guilty, so they lied about it from the very beginning.
Yes, and so I think that's significant for two reasons. One is intent is really important in these kinds of cases. Juries are instructed to look at the totality of the circumstances of what a person said and did to determine whether they had a corrupt intent in what they're doing. And so I think those shifting stories is really important there. I think the other thing that's important is this makes it all the more important to find out what Paul Manafort knows. And I still think there's some possibility that he could flip because he was present at that meeting. And I think that when you're Robert Mueller, your job is not so much to get President Trump as it is a quest for the truth. What really happened? And Paul Manafort was present at that meeting. And so if I were Robert Mueller, I would still find value in having him cooperate if you could find out what really happened at that meeting.
And Barbara, stick around because I want to ask you about the jurors' forum. Absolutely fascinating that the foreman of the jury decided to sort of go against regular practice. and actually talk about on the form that there was only one juror holding out. And you have to ask, who was that one juror? I'm not saying I want to root anybody out, but very fascinating that only one juror held out on 10 counts. Fascinating, some might say ridiculous, obviously, the jurors believed. So, thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.